He thought I was just a deaf, harmless old woman, moving in to die. Every night at 3 a.m., he dragged her to the basement for discipline. He didn't know I spent 30 years as a court stenographer. I wasn't sleeping. I was building a case file that would put him away for life. And tonight, I hand it over. You know they say a mother knows her child better than anyone. We know their cry, their walk, the way they lie when they break a vase. But I realized at 68 years old that I didn't know my son Richard at all. I knew the mask he wore, the charming smile that won him scholarships, the firm handshake that made him the CEO of a children's charity. But the man underneath, I met him for the first time on a Tuesday night in November, and I wish I had died before I did. I had moved into Richard's estate 3 weeks prior. It was a sprawling modern fortress of glass and steel on the edge of the city. My own house had become too much to manage after my hip surgery, and Richard insisted. "Come live with us, Mom," he had said, his voice smooth as expensive scotch. "Sarah would love the company. You'll be treated like a queen." A queen, that's what he said. But from the moment I arrived, I felt more like a prisoner in a very expensive museum. The house was cold, not just temperature-wise. Though Richard kept the thermostat at a shivering 65 degrees, but emotionally cold, silence hung heavy in the hallways. My daughter-in-law Sarah was a ghost in her own home. She was a beautiful girl, 30 years old, with eyes the color of honey, but she moved like she was walking on cracked ice. She flinched when the phone rang. She apologized if she breathed too loudly. "I'm just clumsy, Martha," she told me the second day, pulling the sleeves of her cashmere sweater down over her wrists. I had noticed a purple bruise blooming near her thumb. I tripped over the rug. I nodded, sipping my tea. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe my son had married a clumsy woman, not a battered one. I was a retired court stenographer. I had spent 40 years listening to the worst stories humanity had to offer: domestic battery, assault, murder. I didn't want to bring my work home, so I told myself it was just a rug. But then came the nights. My room was on the first floor, a guest suite that was soundproof to keep out the highway noise. Or so Richard said. But soundproofing works both ways. It keeps the noise out, but it also keeps the screams in. For the first 2 weeks I slept poorly. The bed was too soft, the sheets too silky. I would wake up at odd hours, usually around 3 a.m., thirsty and disoriented. On the third Tuesday, I decided to go to the kitchen for water. I opened my bedroom door. The house was pitch black. The only light came from the digital clock on the microwave down the hall, glowing a neon green 3:03 a.m. I stepped into the hallway leaning on my cane. The silence was absolute. No refrigerator hum, no wind, just the heavy oppressive quiet of a house holding its breath. Then I heard it. Creak. It wasn't a footstep. It was the heavy, distinct groan of the solid oak door that led to the finished basement. Richard called it his home office. He had forbidden anyone from entering it. "Confidential client files, Mom," he had warned me with a tight smile. "Very sensitive stuff. Legal liabilities." I froze in the shadows of the living room. I watched as the basement door, which was usually locked, clicked shut. I waited. A minute passed. Then 2. I expected to hear Richard come back up, maybe getting a late-night snack. Instead, I heard a sound that made my blood turn to slush in my veins. It was a thud, dull, heavy, and wet, like a sack of flour being dropped on concrete. And then a voice, my son's voice, but it wasn't the smooth, charming voice he used at charity galas. It was a low, guttural growl that vibrated through the floorboards. "You didn't smile enough tonight, Sarah." I pressed my hand over my mouth to stifle a gasp. I moved closer to the floor vent, the metal grate that connected the main floor to the basement ventilation system. Sound travels strangely in big houses. If you know where to listen, you can hear everything. I tried. Richard. Sarah's voice floated up, thin and terrified. She sounded like she was crying but trying desperately to stop. I smiled at the donor. I thanked him for the check. You looked at your shoes, Richard spat. Thud. Another sound, this time sharper, a slap, a belt. When you look at your shoes, you look weak, and when you look weak, you make me look weak. Do we need to review the lesson on eye contact again? No, please, Sarah whimpered. Please, Richard. My back still hurts from last time. I promise I'll do better. We're going to practice, Richard said. His voice dropped to a whisper that was somehow louder than a scream. Stand up and take off the shirt. I want to see if you remember the posture drills. I stood there in the dark clutching my cane until my knuckles turned white. My son, my golden boy, the man who was featured in Forbes last month for his work with orphans. He wasn't working late. He was downstairs in his soundproof dungeon torturing his wife because she looked at her shoes. I wanted to run down there. I wanted to beat down the door with my cane and scream at him to stop. But 40 years in a courtroom had taught me one undeniable truth. If you strike at a monster and miss, the victim pays the price. If I burst in there now, he would stop. He would charm me. He would say it was a misunderstanding, role play a game. And the moment I turned my back or the moment he put me in a home, he would kill her. I knew it in my bones. He would kill her to keep his secret. I needed proof. Irrefutable, admissible, undeniable proof. I stepped back from the vent, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I retreated to my room, closing the door silently. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at my hands. They were old hands, liver-spotted, trembling, but they were fast. They used to type 250 words per minute. I reached for my knitting bag on the nightstand. Inside, buried under skeins of gray wool, was my old steno machine. I kept it for nostalgia, a relic of a past life. I pulled it out. The keys were cold. Okay, Richard the First whispered to the dark room. You want to teach lessons? Let's start the record. I sat on the edge of my bed until the sun came up. I didn't type a single word that night. My hands were shaking too badly. Instead, I just listened. I listened to the silence that followed the violence. I listened to the water running in the upstairs bathroom as my son washed the sweat of his exertion off his body. I listened to the soft, terrified footsteps of my daughter-in-law creeping back to the guest room she slept in when she was being bad. By 7 a.m. I had composed myself. I washed my face with cold water and put on a little rouge. I put on my favorite floral cardigan. I looked in the mirror and practiced my smile. It had to be the smile of a slightly deaf, harmless old woman who cared more about her knitting than her surroundings. It had to be perfect. I walked into the kitchen at 7:15 a.m. The room was bright and sunny with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the manicured lawn. It looked like a page out of a magazine. Richard was sitting at the island reading the financial news on his tablet. He looked immaculate, crisp white shirt, silk tie, not a hair out of place. He looked like the picture of success. Good morning, Mom, he said without looking up. His voice was smooth, warm, and utterly terrifying. Did you sleep well? This was the test, the first of many. I shuffled over to the coffee pot, leaning heavily on my cane. Oh, wonderful, dear, I lied, my voice cracking just the right amount. That mattress is like sleeping on a cloud. I didn't hear a thing all night. I must have been out by 9. Richard looked up then. He studied my face. He was looking for a flicker of knowledge. He was looking for the judgment a mother usually gives a son when he has done wrong. I gave him nothing but a confused, kindly smile. That's good, he said, relaxing visibly. I worry about the highway noise. Sarah had a rough night, though. She's been under the weather. As if on cue, Sarah walked in. If I hadn't heard what I heard 6 hours ago, I might have missed it. But now I saw everything. I saw the way she hugged the wall as she entered, keeping distance between herself and Richard. I saw the turtleneck sweater she was wearing even though the kitchen was warm. And I saw her eyes, they were red-rimmed and hollow. Good morning, she whispered, looking at the floor. Good morning, darling, Richard said. He stood up and walked over to her. Sarah flinched. Just a tiny fraction of an inch, but I saw it. Richard placed a hand on her shoulder and squeezed. I saw her knees buckle slightly under the pressure. You look tired, Sarah. Did you forget to take your vitamins again? It was a threat. I didn't know what the threat meant, but Sarah did. I'm sorry, Richard, she said quickly. I'll take them now. Do that, he said, kissing her on the forehead. It was a kiss of ownership, not affection. We have the gala next week. I need you glowing. No bags under the eyes. Appearance is everything. He turned to me, flashing that $1,000,000 smile. Mom, I have to run. Big meeting with the board. Sarah is going to stay home and rest today. Maybe you two can do a puzzle or something quiet. She needs quiet. Of course, I said, pouring sugar into my coffee. We will have a lovely quiet day. Goodbye, dear. He grabbed his briefcase and walked out. I waited. I waited until I heard the heavy front door close. I waited until I heard the engine of his luxury sedan rev and fade down the driveway. Only then did I turn to Sarah. She was standing by the sink, gripping the counter so hard her knuckles were white. She was staring out the window, but I knew she wasn't seeing the trees. She was seeing the basement. I walked over to her. I wanted to hug her. I wanted to tell her I knew. I wanted to promise her that I would save her. But I stopped myself. If I told her now, she would panic. She was too broken to hide a secret. If she knew I knew, she would look at me differently when Richard came home. She would look at me with hope and Richard. Richard sniffed out hope like a bloodhound sniffs out fear. If he suspected I was an ally, he would isolate her. He would kick me out, or worse, he would silence me. No, I had to be the only one carrying this burden. Sarah needed to believe I was just a useless old woman so she could act naturally. Sarah, dear, I said, keeping my voice light and oblivious. I seemed to have dropped a stitch in my knitting pattern. Would you mind driving me to the craft store later? I need some new needles. She turned to me, blinking tears away. She looked relieved that I hadn't asked about her red eyes or her turtleneck. Oh, sure, Martha. I can do that. Wonderful, I said. I need very specific needles, sharp ones. I turned back to my coffee, hiding the tremor in my hands. I wasn't going to the craft store for knitting needles. I needed equipment. Richard thought he had locked the basement door. He thought he had silenced his wife, but he forgot one thing. He invited a court stenographer into his house, and for the last 40 years I had learned one very important lesson. The person holding the pen writes the history, and starting tonight I was going to write his end. Honey, let me tell you something about being invisible. When you are an old woman with a cane and a floral purse, people look right through you. They see the wrinkles and the gray hair, and they assume your brain is just as soft as your skin. That was my superpower. Richard thought I was just sitting in the rocking chair counting stitches. He didn't know I was counting felonies. That afternoon, Sarah drove me to the strip mall. She stayed in the car. She said she had a headache, but I knew she just didn't want anyone to see her face under the fluorescent lights of a store. I walked into the electronics shop. The young man behind the counter looked at me like I was lost. He asked if I needed help finding the toaster ovens. I smiled my sweet, confused grandma smile. I told him I needed something to record my church choir practice because my memory was fading. I told him I needed something that could pick up a whisper from the back of the room. He sold me a digital voice recorder with a high-gain directional microphone. It cost $300. I paid cash. When I got back to the house, I went straight to my room. I locked the door. I took my knitting bag, which was a large wicker basket lined with floral fabric. I took a pair of scissors and carefully cut a small slit in the lining right near the handle. I slid the recorder inside. I positioned the microphone so it faced the mesh weave of the wicker. It was invisible. Unless you dug through 3 pounds of gray wool, you would never find it. But the recorder was just the backup. The real weapon was my steno machine. You see, a court stenographer does not just type. We capture the truth in real time. We do not paraphrase, we do not interpret. If a murderer stutters, we type the stutter. If a victim screams, we type the scream. We are the silent witnesses who make sure that justice has a transcript. I set up my station in the corner of my room. I placed the steno machine on my lap. It is a quiet machine. The keys do not click like a typewriter. They whisper. I threw a heavy Afghan blanket over my legs and the machine hiding it completely. To anyone watching, I would just look like an old woman knitting in the dark, my hands moving under the blanket to keep warm. I waited. Dinner that night was an exercise in torture. Richard was in a foul mood. He complained that the roast was dry. He complained that the wine was too warm. He complained that Sarah was chewing too loudly. Every time he spoke, Sarah flinched. I sat there eating my dry roast, playing the part of the oblivious mother. I asked Richard about his charity. I asked him about the gala. He lit up. He loved talking about himself. He told me he was going to give a speech about protecting the innocent, about creating safe spaces for children. I almost choked on my peas. The irony was so thick I could taste it. At 9 p.m., Richard dismissed us. He told Sarah to go to bed early because she looked haggard. He told me to get my rest. I went to my room, I put on my nightgown, I turned off the lights, but I did not sleep. I sat in the armchair by the air vent. I placed the knitting bag on the floor with the microphone pointed at the grate. I put the steno machine on my lap under the blanket. I rested my fingers on the keys. The house settled. The heater clicked off. The silence returned. And then at 3:03 a.m. the basement door opened. Creak. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands were steady. My hands remembered the training. I pressed the record button on the device in the bag. The red light blinked once inside the wicker. I heard the heavy footsteps going down the wooden stairs. I heard the lighter stumbling footsteps of Sarah being dragged or pushed. I closed my eyes. I wasn't Mom anymore. I was the official court reporter. From the vent a voice drifted up. You embarrassed me today, Sarah. My fingers moved. Q. You embarrassed me today, Sarah. I didn't mean to, Richard. I just dropped the fork. I didn't mean to, Richard. I just dropped the fork. Clumsy, stupid. Cow. You made me look like I married an idiot. Q. Clumsy, stupid cow. You made me look like I married an idiot. I heard the sound of a belt snapping. Snap. My fingers flew across the keys, capturing the sound. Sound of leather striking skin. Please, Richard. Not the back. I have to wear a dress to the gala. Please, Richard. Not the back. I have to wear a dress to the gala. Then maybe you should learn to hold a fork properly. Q. Then maybe you should learn to hold a fork properly. The sounds that followed were the stuff of nightmares. I sat there in the dark, tears streaming down my face, typing every single gasp, every whimper, every wet thud of violence. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run down there and throw my body in front of her. But I knew I couldn't. I had to build the case. I had to let it happen so I could stop it forever. I typed for 45 minutes. I categorized the crimes in my head as I typed: domestic battery, assault with a deadly weapon, false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress. My son was racking up a life sentence, one sentence at a time. When the basement door finally clicked open again at 3:50 a.m., my hands were cramping. I had typed 5,000 words of horror. I slid the steno machine under the bed and pulled the quilt up to my chin, feigning the deep rhythmic breathing of the elderly. I heard them walk past my door. Richard's footsteps were heavy and confident, the stride of a man who had just finished a workout. Sarah's were uneven, a shuffle of pain. I heard the shower running again. He was washing away the evidence. but he couldn't wash away my transcript. I waited until the house was dead silent again before I pulled the machine back out. In the old days, we used paper tape. Now it's all digital, stored on a little SD card. I popped the card out. It was the size of a fingernail, but it held enough weight to crush my son's life. I wrapped it in a tissue and tucked it inside the hollow body of my favorite knitting needle. A hiding place within a hiding place. The next morning, the kitchen smelled of bleach, strong chemical bleach. Richard was scrubbing the counter when I walked in. He wasn't wearing his suit yet. He was in a t-shirt, and his biceps bulged as he scrubbed a spot that looked perfectly clean to me. "Morning, Mom," he said, too cheerful. "Just doing a little deep cleaning. Sarah spilled some wine last night. Red wine, nightmare to get out." I looked at the counter. I looked at him. "Oh, you're such a good husband," Richard the First said, my voice steady, despite the bile rising in my throat. "Most men wouldn't lift a finger. Sarah is a lucky girl." He beamed. He actually preened under the praise. That was the key to Richard. He didn't just want to be powerful. He wanted to be admired. He needed to be the hero of every story, even the ones where he was the villain. Sarah came down 10 minutes later. She was wearing a silk scarf tied tightly around her neck. Despite the heat of the kitchen, she moved stiffly. When she reached for the coffee pot, I saw a new tremor in her hand. "Here, dear, let me," I said, taking the pot. I poured her a cup. As I handed it to her, I leaned in just for a second. "That's a lovely scarf, Sarah, very chic." Her eyes darted to mine, wide with panic. She was terrified I would ask to see what was underneath. "Thank you, Martha." I felt a draft. "Drafts can be nasty," I said, looking straight at Richard. "They seep into the bones." Richard laughed, slapping the counter with the rag. "You too and your drafts. It's 70 degrees in here. Anyway, I have big news. The gala is sold out. Every table. The mayor is coming. The press is coming. It's going to be the biggest night in the foundation's history." He grabbed an apple from the bowl and bit into it with a crunch that made me flinch. "I need you both to be perfect. Mom, I want you in the blue dress, the matriarch, and Sarah." He turned his gaze on her, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Wear the backless gown, the gold one. It shows off your posture." Sarah dropped her spoon. It clattered loudly against the ceramic bowl. The backless one," she whispered. "Yes," Richard said, his eyes hard. "We worked on your posture last night, remember? You should be ready to show it off. It was a test, a cruel, sadistic test. He wanted to see if she could cover the bruises he had inflicted on her back. He wanted to parade her around like a damaged trophy, daring anyone to notice the cracks." I don't know if it fits, Richard," she stammered. "Make it fit," he said. He checked his watch. "I have to go to the bank. I need to move some funds for the event vendors. The liquidity is tight until the donations clear next week." My ears pricked up. "Liquidity, bank?" "Oh," Richard the First said, feigning confusion. "I have been meaning to ask you. I need to deposit my pension check, but I don't drive anymore. Could I ride along with you?" He hesitated. He didn't want his mother tagging along, but he also wanted to maintain the facade of the devoted son. "Sure, Mom, grab your purse, but we have to be quick. I have to stop by the office to get the ledger from the safe first." The safe? We drove to his office in the city. It wasn't the basement office, it was his public headquarters, the charity building. He parked the car and told me to wait. "I'll just be a minute," he said. "Take your time, dear," I said. "I'll just listen to the radio." As soon as he walked through the glass doors, I opened the glove compartment. Nothing. I checked the center console. Nothing. Then I looked at the keychain he had left in the ignition. He had taken the fob, but he left the ring of useless keys. There was a small silver key and a USB drive. I didn't take the key, that would be noticed, but the USB drive, it was unlabeled. I pulled it out of the port and slipped it into my bra. Richard came back 5 minutes later looking annoyed. Forgot the combination, he muttered to himself as he got in. Had to use the override. Everything okay, dear? I asked innocently. Fine, he snapped, just administrative headaches. Sarah's trust fund is complicated to access without her signature, but I found a workaround. He froze. He realized he had said too much. He looked at me sharply. What was that, dear? I asked, adjusting my hearing aid. You found a what? He relaxed. Nothing, Mom, just business talk, boring stuff. Oh, I hate business, I said, patting his arm. You're so smart to handle it all for her. She really wouldn't understand it, would she? No, he said, smiling that shark smile again. She wouldn't. He started the car. He thought he was safe. He thought he was sitting next to a senile old woman who couldn't hear well. He didn't know he was sitting next to a woman who had just stolen his digital financial records and confirmed that he was embezzling his wife's inheritance. I touched the lump of the USB drive against my chest. I had the abuse on tape. Now I had the motive in my bra. But I needed one more thing. I needed to catch him in the act, publicly, irrefutably. The gala was in 3 days. He wanted Sarah to wear the backless dress. Fine. I would make sure she wore it, but I would make sure the whole world saw what he had written on her skin. You know what the most dangerous thing in the world is? It is not a gun. It is not a bomb. It is an arrogant man who thinks he is the smartest person in the room. Richard was so sure of his superiority that he left his digital life in the hands of a woman he thought couldn't figure out how to program a microwave. That afternoon, while Richard was at the office, I went into the library. I locked the door. I pulled the USB drive out of my bra. I sat down at the family computer. Richard didn't even have a password on the guest account. He didn't think anyone in this house was brave enough to snoop. I plugged in the drive. A folder popped up. It was labeled Project Charity. I opened it. It wasn't about orphans. It wasn't about building schools. It was a roadmap of theft. There were spreadsheets showing transfers from Sarah's inheritance trust into a shell company in the Cayman Islands. There were scans of her signature. They were clearly forged. The loops on the S were too wide. I knew Sarah's handwriting. It was small and cramped, like she was trying to take up as little space in the world as possible. These signatures were big and bold. Richard's handwriting. He had drained $4 million in 2 years. I felt sick. He wasn't just beating her, he was stealing her future. He was going to leave her broken and penniless. I copied everything. I moved the files onto my own encrypted drive, the one I kept in my knitting bag. Then I ejected his drive and put it back in my pocket. I heard the front door open. Richard was home early. I shut down the computer and grabbed a book off the shelf. Great Expectations, fitting. Richard walked into the library. He loosened his tie. He looked stressed. Mom, he said, what are you doing in here? Oh, just reading, I said, closing the book. This computer makes such a loud humming noise. Does it work? He laughed. Yes, Mom, it works. It's top of the line. He walked over to the desk and shuffled some papers. I'm swamped. The gala is in 2 days and the event planner just quit, said she. Couldn't handle the pressure. Weak. This was my opening. I stood up and walked over to him. I put a hand on his arm. Oh, Richard, you carry so much weight. You shouldn't have to deal with party planning. You are the CEO, I know, he said, sighing. But someone has to organize the presentation, the slideshow, the donor list. It's a mess. Let me help, I said. He looked at me. I organized the church bake sale for 20 years, I said. I can handle a few slides. Let me organize the photos for the presentation. You focus on your speech. You need to sound inspiring. Let me do the grunt work. He hesitated. He looked at me. He saw a gray-haired woman in a cardigan who wanted to be useful. He didn't see the court stenographer. He didn't see the spy. Fine, he said, but don't mess it up. Keep it simple. Photos of the kids we helped. Photos of me and Sarah looking happy. and the donor names, happy photos, I said, got it. He handed me a flash drive from his pocket, a different one. This has the template, just drop the photos in and Mom, yes dear. Make sure Sarah looks good in the pictures, no bad angles. I will choose the most revealing photos I can find, I promised. He nodded and walked out. I held the flash drive in my hand. He had just handed me the keys to the castle. He wanted a presentation. Oh, I was going to give him a presentation. I went back to my room. I loaded his template. It was boring, standard corporate slides. I opened my own folder. The folder labeled the truth. I had the audio files from the basement. I had the transcripts I had typed. But I needed visuals. Audio is powerful, but people are visual creatures. They need to see the horror to believe it. I waited until Sarah went to take a shower. I crept into her room. Her phone was on the nightstand. I knew the code. She used her birthday, 1104. I opened her gallery. My heart broke. There were hundreds of photos, but they weren't of sunsets or food. They were photos of injuries, a bruised arm, a split lip, a black eye. She had been documenting it, just like I hoped. She was building a file she was too scared to use. I sent them all to myself. Then I deleted the transfer history. I went back to my room. I opened the presentation file. Slide 1, Welcome to the Richard Vance Foundation. Slide 2, Our Mission, Protecting the Vulnerable. I deleted the photo of the smiling orphans on slide 2. I replaced it with a photo of Sarah's back covered in welts. I added an audio file to the transition. The clip of Richard screaming, "You didn't smile enough." I went through every slide. I replaced the donor list with the bank statement showing the embezzlement. I replaced the thank you slide with the court transcript of the beating from Tuesday night. I saved the file. I named it final_gala_presentation_2. I put it on the drive. Now all I had to do was get it into the projector at the venue. And make sure Richard didn't check it before he walked on stage. The day of the gala arrived with a gray, ominous sky. It felt fitting. The house was vibrating with tension. Sarah was in her room preparing. That meant she was trying to cover the fresh bruise on her collarbone with heavy foundation. Richard was pacing the living room rehearsing his speech. "We create safe havens," he declaimed to the empty air, gesturing with a glass of scotch. "We build walls to keep the darkness out." "That sounds beautiful, dear," I said from the armchair, knitting a scarf that was getting longer by the hour, very moving. He stopped and looked at me. "Is the presentation ready? Did you load it onto the main server?" "I did," I said. "I gave it to the AV technician myself this morning when I dropped off the centerpieces. He said everything is set." "Did you use the photo of us in Cabo?" he asked, "the one where Sarah is laughing." "I used the most honest photo of your marriage I could find," I said. He nodded satisfied. "Good, appearance is key tonight. The mayor is bringing the press. If this goes well, we get the grant for the new wing. If it goes badly..." He trailed off, his eyes darkening. He didn't have to finish the sentence. "It will go exactly as you deserve," I said. He smiled, thinking it was a compliment. "Thanks, Mom." We left for the venue at 6 p.m. Sarah came down the stairs wearing the gold backless gown. It was stunning, and it was terrifying. Her back was exposed down to the small of her spine. She had used so much makeup on her skin that she looked like a mannequin. If you stood 3 feet away, she looked flawless. If you stood 3 inches away, you could see the texture of the concealer over the welts. Richard inspected her like he was buying a horse. He walked a circle around her. He touched her shoulder. She flinched. "Stop that," he hissed. "Don't flinch. Flinching implies fear. We are a happy couple." "I know," Sarah whispered. "I'm sorry. You look radiant," I said, stepping between them. "Come on, we don't want to be late." The venue was a ballroom in the city center. Chandeliers, champagne towers, a string quartet playing Mozart. It smelled of money and hypocrisy. I took my seat at the front table reserved for family. Sarah sat next to me. Richard went to work the room, shaking hands, flashing that shark smile. I leaned over to Sarah. I put my hand on her trembling arm. Sarah, I whispered, listen to me. She looked at me, her eyes wide with fear. What, did I do something wrong? No, I said, you have done nothing wrong. But tonight is going to be difficult. I need you to be brave when the presentation starts. Don't look at the screen, look at me. Why? She asked. Because the truth is coming out, I said, and it's going to be loud. She stared at me confused. She didn't understand. She thought I was just a senile old woman talking nonsense. The lights dimmed. The string quartet stopped. Richard walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit him. He looked like a god. Tall, handsome, commanding. The applause was thunderous. Thank you, he said, his voice booming through the speakers. Thank you all for coming. Tonight we celebrate the sanctity of the home, the safety of the family. He clicked the remote in his hand. The screen behind him lit up. Slide 1, welcome to the Richard Vance Foundation. The crowd clapped politely. Richard smiled. He was in his element. We believe that every person deserves to feel safe, he said, to feel loved, to feel protected from the harsh realities of the world. He clicked the remote. Slide 2. I held my breath. The screen didn't show smiling orphans. It didn't show a happy couple in Cabo. It showed a high-resolution photo of Sarah's back, raw and bleeding, taken 3 days ago. The image was massive, 10 feet tall. Every welt, every bruise, every cut was magnified. The ballroom went silent, dead silent. A gasp rippled through the front row. Richard didn't see it. The screen was behind him. He was looking at the audience, basking in their attention. He thought the gasp was awe. It is our duty, he continued, to shine a light in the darkness, to expose the suffering that hides in plain sight. He clicked the remote again. Slide 3. A video started playing, but there was no image, just a black screen with white text scrolling across it. A transcript. Q. You embarrassed me today, Sarah. I didn't mean to, Richard. I just dropped the fork, and then the audio played. My high-gain microphone had done its job. Richard's voice, unmistakable, filled the ballroom. Clumsy, stupid cow, you made me look like I married an idiot. Snap! The sound of the belt hitting skin echoed through the speakers like a gunshot. Richard froze. His smile faltered. He heard his own voice. He turned around slowly to look at the screen. He saw the transcript. He saw the date stamped Tuesday, 3:03 a.m. He looked back at the audience. The mayor was standing up. The donors were whispering. The press photographers were flashing their cameras, not at him but at the screen. This is a technical difficulty, Richard stammered, his face going pale. Someone hack? Someone changed the file. He clicked the remote, frantically trying to skip the slide. Slide 4, a bank statement, highlighted in red. Transfer to Shell Corp $50,000. Signature Sarah Vance forged. This is a lie, Richard screamed. Cut the feed. Cut the power. He ran toward the AV booth at the side of the stage. But before he could get there, the audio changed again. It wasn't the basement recording this time. It was a new recording. One I had made in the car. Sarah's trust fund is complicated to access without her signature, but I found a workaround. Richard stopped running. He stood in the center of the stage, trapped in the spotlight. He looked out at the sea of faces. He looked for an ally. He looked for someone to save him. He looked at me. I was sitting in the front row. I wasn't knitting anymore. I was holding my cane like a scepter. I looked him dead in the eye, and for the first time I let the mask drop. I didn't smile like a confused grandma. I smiled like a judge delivering a death sentence. I slowly raised my glass of champagne in a toast. Richard's mouth opened. He finally realized it wasn't a hacker, it wasn't a glitch. It was Mom. Richard saw the crowd turning. He saw his legacy crumbling in real time. He dropped the microphone. It hit the stage with a deafening screech of feedback. He jumped down from the stage. He didn't run for the exit. He ran for us. He was coming for Sarah. He needed to silence her. He needed to regain control the only way he knew how, by force. "You ungrateful witch!" he screamed, charging through the tables. "I gave you everything. I bought you that dress." Sit down. People scattered. Waiters dropped trays. Richard was a bull in a china shop, fueled by rage and adrenaline. He reached our table in seconds. He raised his hand. It was a reflex. He was going to strike her right there in front of the donors and the press. He was so lost in his own power that he forgot laws existed. Sarah flinched, closing her eyes, waiting for the impact. But the blow never landed. I didn't move. I didn't block him. I simply gripped my cane and looked past him, toward the heavy double doors at the side of the ballroom. Crash! The doors flew open, hitting the walls with a sound that shook the room. "Police!" a voice bellowed, amplified and commanding. "Everyone down, get on the ground." 6 uniformed officers flooded into the room, moving in a tight practice formation. They didn't stop to look at the guests. They had one target. Richard froze. His hand was still raised in the air, trembling. He looked left. Officers blocking the exit. He looked right. 2 more officers flanking the stage. He was surrounded. "Richard Vance!" The lead officer shouted, his weapon drawn and leveled. "Drop to your knees, do it now." Richard blinked, disoriented. The rage on his face was replaced by confusion. He looked at the police, then he looked at me. "Mom," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "What is this?" "This is the end of the line, Richard," I said, my voice cutting through the tension like a razor. "I told you I was handling the guest list." For a split second, I saw the violence flare in his eyes again. He looked at Sarah, calculating if he had time to hurt her before they reached him. He took a step forward. "Taser, taser, taser." The lead officer didn't hesitate. He fired. The probes hit Richard squarely in the chest. Richard convulsed. His body went rigid and he dropped like a stone, hitting the expensive carpet with a heavy thud right next to my orthopedic shoes. The room went dead silent. The only sound was the clicking of the taser, and Richard's heavy, ragged breathing as the officers swarmed him, pinning his arms behind his back. "Richard Vance," the officer said, snapping the handcuffs on tight. "You are under arrest for domestic battery, embezzlement, and wire fraud. You have the right to remain silent." Richard lifted his head from the carpet. His hair was messed up. His tie was crooked. He looked up at me as they hauled him to his feet. "Fix this, Mom," he begged, the arrogance gone, replaced by the whining voice of a child caught stealing cookies. "Tell them it's a mistake. I'm your son." I stood up slowly, leaning on my cane. I walked over to where they were holding him. I looked him right in the eye. "You are not my son," I said, loud enough for the press to hear. "My son died a long time ago. You are just a man who hits women, and I hope the judge gives you a life sentence." They dragged him out the side doors, past the stunned donors and the flashing cameras. I turned to Sarah. She was standing there, staring at the empty space where Richard used to be, her chest heaving. "Is it over?" she asked. "The abuse is over," I said, smoothing my cardigan. "The rest is just paperwork." The police car lights flashed red and blue against the ballroom windows, a disco ball of consequences. Once Richard was shoved into the back of the cruiser, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. The shock wore off and the self-preservation kicked in. The vultures descended. Suddenly everyone was Sarah's best friend. The mayor's wife, who had ignored Sarah for 3 years, rushed over with a napkin, dabbing at her own dry eyes. "Oh, you poor dear," she gushed, reaching out to touch Sarah's arm. "We had no idea. If we had known, we would have stopped him." I stepped in front of Sarah, blocking the woman with my cane. You knew he cut her off when she spoke, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. You knew he didn't let her have a credit card. You knew she flinched when he raised a glass. You saw the signs, Gladys. You just liked his donations more than you liked her safety. Back off. Gladys recoiled like I had slapped her. Next came the board of directors. Mr. Henderson, the treasurer, looked like he was about to have a heart attack. He pushed through the crowd, sweating profusely. Martha, Mrs. Vance, he stammered, the presentation, the slides, the bank statements. Is it true? Is the $4 million really gone? I looked at him with pity. Mr. Henderson, Richard drained those accounts dry. He bought a yacht in Italy and a condo in Miami under a shell company. I gave the routing numbers to the FBI about 20 minutes ago. If you hurry, you might be able to seize the yacht before he liquidates it for legal fees. Henderson turned pale and ran for the exit, dialing his lawyer on his cell phone. Come on, I said to Sarah, taking her cold hand. Let's go. The air in here is toxic. We walked out the front doors of the venue. The paparazzi were waiting at the bottom of the steps, a wall of flashing lights. I put my arm around Sarah's waist. She tried to hide her face, but I squeezed her side. Head up, I whispered. You are not the criminal. You are the survivor. Let them see you walking away. She straightened her spine. It must have hurt, with the welts on her back, but she did it. We walked down the steps, past the cameras, and into the waiting town car I had hired earlier that afternoon, using Richard's emergency credit card. As the door closed, shutting out the noise of the city, Sarah collapsed. She didn't faint, but she melted into the leather seat, all the adrenaline leaving her body at once. She started to shake. Violent, racking tremors. He's gone, she whispered, staring out the window at the receding police lights. He's really gone. He is going to a holding cell, I said, and then because I gave the judge the flight risk evidence, he is going to stay there until trial. You are safe, Sarah. She turned to look at me. Her makeup was streaked with tears. Why? She asked. Why did you do it? You're his mother. You destroyed him. I looked at her. I saw the young woman who had been tortured in a basement while I slept upstairs. I saw the daughter I never had. I didn't destroy him, I said softly. I just turned on the lights. He destroyed himself the first time he raised a hand to you. I reached into my purse and pulled out a tissue. And besides, being a mother doesn't mean protecting your child when they become a monster. It means protecting the people they hurt. We rode the rest of the way in silence. When we pulled up to the estate, it looked different. The house was dark. The driveway was empty. It didn't look like a fortress anymore. It just looked like a pile of bricks and glass. We walked inside. The house was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy, oppressive silence of fear. It was just empty. Sarah stood in the foyer. She looked at the door to the basement. The lock I had picked earlier was still disengaged. What do we do now? She asked, her voice echoing in the large hall. He controlled everything, the bank accounts, the cards, the house deed. I have nothing, Martha. He stole it all. I'm free, but I'm destitute. I walked over to the security panel on the wall and punched in the code to disable the alarm. You are not destitute, I said, unpinning my gala corsage and setting it on the table. You think Richard was the only one moving money around this week? She frowned. What do you mean? I told you I was a court stenographer, I said, turning to face her with a small, tired smile. But before that, I worked in payroll. I know how to balance a ledger. I patted my knitting bag. Richard stole $4 million from your trust. But he made a mistake. He left his passwords on a sticky note in his safe. He thought he was untouchable. Sarah's eyes widened. Martha, what did you do? I corrected an accounting error, I said. But that is a conversation for tomorrow morning. Tonight we sleep, and for the first time in 3 years, Sarah, you can sleep with your door unlocked. I watched her shoulders drop. She took a deep breath, the first full breath I had seen her take since I moved in. Thank you, she whispered. Go to bed, I said. I'll make breakfast in the morning, waffles, and we will eat them while we watch the news coverage of his arraignment. She went upstairs. I stayed in the foyer for a moment. I looked at the basement door one last time. I walked over to it, closed it, and turned the deadbolt. Then I snapped the key off in the lock. It was finished. They say justice is blind, but I have always found that justice actually has excellent hearing, especially when you provide it with a high-definition audio recording. The morning after the gala, the sun hit the kitchen island differently. It didn't glare off the marble like it used to. It felt warm. I was making waffles. I poured the batter onto the hot iron and listened to the sizzle. For the first time in weeks, the house didn't smell like fear and expensive cologne. It smelled like vanilla and coffee. Sarah walked into the kitchen at 9 a.m. She had slept for 10 hours. Her eyes were still puffy and the bruises on her arms were still purple, but she was walking upright. She wasn't hugging the wall. She was wearing a t-shirt that showed her arms. It was a small rebellion, but it was a start. Good morning, Martha, she said. Her voice was raspy from crying, but it was steady. Waffles are ready, I said, sliding a plate toward her. Eat. You need your strength for the lawyers. She sat down and picked up a fork. She looked at the television mounted in the corner. I had the local news on. The headline was in bold red letters, Charity CO arrested in gala shocker. Richard's mugshot was on the screen. He looked angry. He looked entitled. He looked like a man who was about to scream at the manager. He looks small, Sarah said quietly. He is small, I said. Prison orange is not going to be his color. She took a bite of the waffle, but she put the fork down quickly. The worry was back in her eyes. Martha, I have been thinking about the money. You said you corrected an accounting error, but the FBI is going to freeze his assets. Even if he stole from me, it could take years to get that money back from the government. How am I going to pay for the lawyers? How am I going to pay the mortgage on this place? I turned off the stove and wiped my hands on my apron. I walked over to my knitting bag, which was sitting on the counter. I pulled out my laptop. Sarah, do you know why Richard kept his passwords on a sticky note in his safe? I asked, opening the screen. She shook her head. Because he was arrogant, I corrected. He thought he was the only one smart enough to understand offshore banking. He didn't realize that I spent 20 years transcribing the trials of white-collar criminals. I learned a few things about wire transfers. I turned the laptop toward her. On the screen was a bank account dashboard. It wasn't Richard's account. It wasn't the Cayman Islands account. It was a new account, in the name of Sarah Miller, her maiden name. The balance was displayed in large black numbers, $4,150,000.00. Sarah gasped. She dropped her fork. It clattered onto the plate. What is this? Yesterday afternoon, while Richard was getting his hair cut for the gala, I logged into his Cayman Shell Company. I explained, pouring myself more coffee. I initiated a wire transfer. I moved every single cent of your trust fund principal plus the management fees he had paid himself back into a domestic account under your control. But isn't that stealing? She whispered. No, dear, I said, smiling. It is repatriation of stolen assets. I just beat the FBI to it. The transfer cleared 4 hours before he was arrested. The money is yours, it is clean, and he can't touch it. She stared at the screen. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief. The crushing weight of poverty, the fear of being homeless, it all evaporated in the steam of the coffee. You saved me, she said. You didn't just stop him, you saved my life. I just balanced the books, I said. Now eat your waffle. We have a meeting with the district attorney at noon and I want you to look fierce. The next 3 months were a blur of depositions and court dates. Richard tried everything. He hired a shark of a defense attorney who tried to claim the recordings were illegal wiretaps. He tried to claim I was senile and hallucinating. He even tried to claim Sarah was into rough play and had consented to the abuse. But he forgot who he was dealing with. I sat on the witness stand in my best floral dress clutching my cane. The defense attorney, a slick man named Mr. Sterling, paced back and forth trying to rattle me. "Mrs. Vance," he sneered, "you claim you heard these threats. But isn't it true you wear hearing aids? Isn't it true you are nearly 70 years old? How can we trust your memory?" I adjusted my glasses. I looked at the judge. Then I looked at the court reporter sitting in the corner tapping away on her machine. "I don't rely on memory, sir," I said clearly. "I rely on the record. And if you would like, I can read back your last question to you at 200 words per minute just to prove that my faculties are quite intact." The courtroom laughed. The judge hid a smile behind his hand. Then we played the tapes. There is no defense against the sound of your own voice enjoying violence. We played the basement tapes, we played the car tapes, we played the gala tapes. Richard sat at the defense table and shrank. He couldn't charm the jury. He couldn't smile his way out of the sound of a leather belt hitting skin. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. They didn't need lunch. The foreman of the jury was a young schoolteacher. He stood up clutching the verdict form. He didn't look at Richard. Jurors never look at the defendant when the news is bad. We, the jury, find the defendant Richard Vance guilty on all counts. Guilty of domestic battery, guilty of aggravated assault, guilty of grand larceny, guilty of fraud. The word guilty rang out 4 times. It was a rhythmic percussive sound. To me it sounded better than Mozart. Richard didn't scream this time. He slumped. The air went out of him. The arrogance that had held him upright for 35 years simply evaporated, leaving behind a hollow, angry man. The judge set the sentencing for next month, but he revoked bail immediately. "Remand to custody," the judge said, banging the gavel. Thwack! As the bailiffs moved in to cuff him, Richard turned to look at the gallery. He looked past his expensive defense attorney. He looked past the weeping members of his former board. He looked right at me. "Mom," he mouthed. Why? I stood up. I didn't mouth anything back. I simply touched my hand to my heart, then pointed to Sarah. It was a simple gesture. I chose her. He sneered, turning his back on us as they led him through the side door. That was the last time I saw my son as a free man. The judge eventually gave him 15 years. In white-collar prisons, they usually play tennis, but because of the violent nature of his assault charges, Richard went to a medium-security facility. I hear the showers there are cold. I find that poetic. We walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sun. The press was there, but this time Sarah didn't hide. She put on her sunglasses, lifted her chin, and walked straight through the crowd to our waiting car. She didn't answer questions. She didn't need to. The bruises were fading, but the strength was just starting to show. 6 months later, we were sitting on the porch of a yellow bungalow near the coast. We sold the estate. We sold the glass fortress with the soundproof basement and the cold marble floors. We took the money, along with the recovered trust fund, and we started over. This house was smaller. It squeaked when the wind blew. It had mismatched mugs and a garden that was slightly overgrown, but it was warm, and most importantly, it was loud. We played music, we laughed, we slammed doors just to prove that no one would get hurt if we did. Sarah walked out onto the porch carrying a tray of lemonade. She looked different. The hollow look was gone. She had gained a little weight and her skin glowed. She was taking art classes at the community college. She was volunteering at a women's shelter, teaching them how to document their own stories. "He looks happy," Robert said, watching his son. "Mail's here," she said, dropping a stack of envelopes on the table. "You got a letter from the prison." I looked at the white envelope with the Department of Corrections stamp. "Richard wrote to me once a month. usually asking for money, usually blaming me. I picked it up. I looked at his handwriting. It was still jagged and angry. Do you want to read it? Sarah asked, sipping her lemonade. I stood up and walked to the edge of the porch. No, I said. I tore the envelope in half, then in quarters, then into confetti. I tossed the pieces over the railing and watched the sea breeze carry them away into the hydrangeas. I've read enough of his words, I said. The transcript is closed. I sat back down and picked up my knitting. I was making a baby blanket for the neighbor's new grandchild. Yellow and white yarn, soft, gentle. Sarah watched me for a moment, smiling. You know, Martha, she said, I never thanked you for the waffle iron. The what? The waffle iron, she laughed. That first morning you made waffles, it was the first time in 3 years someone cooked for me without expecting me to pay for it. Waffles are important, I said. Breakfast is the most important meal of the day, especially when you're starting a new life. She reached over and squeezed my hand. Her grip was strong now, no tremors. I'm glad you moved in, she whispered. Me too, I said. I came to retire, but I ended up working one last case. Best work of my career. I looked out at the ocean. I thought about the steno machine tucked away in the back of my closet. I wouldn't need it again. I didn't need to record the darkness anymore. Now I just wanted to listen to the waves. My son was gone, but I had a daughter, and in this sunny, squeaky house, that was more than enough. So, friends, that is how I saved my daughter-in-law from the man I raised. It wasn't the retirement I expected, but I have to say the view is much better from here. What would you have done? Would you have turned your own child in, or would you have tried to handle it quietly? Tell me in the comments below. And if you want to hear another story about a woman taking control of her life, click the video on your screen right now. You won't believe what she found in her husband's safe. Thanks for listening.